Hi everybody, with this video I want to give you all a heads up as to the topics I have addressed so far in my Patreon dedicated to the in-depth study of Zodiacal Releasing from the Lot of Daimon Spirit. In this video, you will see and hear my introduction of every video I did so far on this issue, and that is 17 videos in total, and I'm still not done yet. There's so much more to tell you. In each intro slide presented here, you'll hear me address what will be explained about the method, which is amply illustrated with chart examples in that specific video. In this excerpt video, I here and there include a slide that explains some principle I address in that specific video or illustrates it with a chart example. Please note that these are snippets from the videos. They do not logically follow one another as a full explanation. They introduce a line of thought in 2 or 3 slides and then breaks off. This is quite a long video and it's about 1.5 hours, but you can forward this video so you can see what each separate video addresses and you can pick out the topic that has your interest and have a listen. I hope all this piques your interest, and if you want to listen to it all, join my Patreon please. You will not regret it, I promise you. Personally, I keep being fascinated by this specific time load method as it is such a profound scenario of whatever motivates you in your life and how you tackle the things that come your way. And for the modern astrologer, I would like to add this because to me this is the only astrological technique that actually illustrates what Jung called the individuation trajectory, the things coming your way in your life and what it all signifies and how you deal with it, based on your natal chart and not on some general theory about individuation. By the way, I do not address this Jungian individuation principle specifically, but perhaps I might someday because it keeps fascinating me. Again, I hope this piques your interest, so have a listen, and I hope to welcome you as a fellow student on my Patreon. And I consider myself a student of this method as it keeps delivering insights and things that I have not experienced before with any other astrological method. So join me and let's study this together. Enjoy. Hello everybody, a warm welcome to everyone tuning into this video on Zodiacal Releasing from Daimon Spirit. And this is the introduction video in which I present the first steps in trying to understand what the Daimon Spirit is all about, because the interesting thing is that the Hermetic lots and the lots in general, as they are often called, the Arabic points, the Arabic points in the chart, which is of course a misnomer because they were introduced into astrology by the Hellenistic astrologers. We need to get to understand what we are actually looking at when we are checking out lots in a chart. So this one will be about, of course, the lot of the Daimon Spirit, and that needs an introduction. So here we go. So this is how it was introduced to us by Robert Schmidt, where he said that this analysis is based on a specific point in your chart called the lot of the daimon, also called the lot of spirit, and that's a very promising term, of course, because spirit has many connotations and deep meanings for a lot of people, and especially the ones interested in astrology. So that's an interesting take on what this lot might represent in your chart. And this lot informs you about how you approach your life as an undertaking, as a business, and what your usual and general style of action is. And that's an interesting statement. So let's have a look at the principles underlying this interesting part of your chart and how it came to be such an important or such an interesting factor in the natal chart. And this was, of course, first discovered in the Greek Hellenistic astrology, as far as I know. So Schmidt brought this to the fore because he was simply translating early Greek material, and this is what popped up, and one of the things that popped up were the 7 Hermetic lots. of which the lot of the diamond is simply one of them. So let's try to get a grip on what this lot actually signifies when it's found in a chart and what you can do with it. And when we want to understand what these lots actually signify in a chart, we need to get back to Plato, one of the favorite philosophers of Robert Schmidt, simply because he studied a lot of his material, was deep into metaphysics of the ancient Greek sort. And yeah, he was really the one that ultimately admitted that, yes, he could no longer deny it. It was never written anywhere in these texts, in the sense like, quote, this is what Plato said about it, and this is how this functions in the astrology. That was never done. So you had to read between the lines, and you had to be quite an adept of Platonic philosophy, which Robert Schmidt was, because he studied at an academic where he needed to learn ancient Greek language and needed and was I believe they needed to read these texts by Plato in the original writing, if in ancient Greek. So that was an intense study, and he did that for the rest of his life afterwards. So yeah, he was pretty deep into this material, but it was never written in the texts. So he was quite in doubt many times about whether or not this was a Platonic view, but he could in the end no longer deny it, because it was simply as a background in a lot of the issues that were brought up in this astrology, in these astrological texts, but they were never explicit. And that's of course exactly how Plato also wrote his dialogues. It was never openly debated in the sense for, now I'm going to make this statement and this is what is brought against it, and this is how it's defended by Socrates. So Plato wrote in dialogues, and these were never explicit. They were not essays in the sense I'm now talking about this topic and this is how I present it, etc. It was also always up to the reader to read between the lines and try to get the grips and try to understand what was the argument that Plato was advancing. So, and this is something that Schmidt discovered in the Greek astrological writings. They were often the things hidden in them, the cryptic nature of these texts, had to do very often with the metaphysical principles behind it. So yeah, in the end he just simply embraced the idea, yeah, this is all about a Platonic view of astrology. And in my case I would like to say that astrology, let's say the Greek Hellenistic astrology, is actually the practical tool to exemplify the Platonic view of life and the view of the world, etc. Something that that all the astrologers and philosophers were after, of course. Now the interesting thing is what I've presented in previous presentations and webinars is the upward and the downward path, and that's all due to Plato, because he had a very interesting idea about it, but the implications of it are very rewarding in trying to get to grips with how you can see astrology and what it's trying to do. So as I said, I did a webinar on this topic, and I've addressed this topic many times whenever I try to get to grips with a certain principle in astrology. And this is the talk that I did for Acuta on nightlight astrology. It was the first one that I was allowed to do there, and it was a big success, and I really enjoyed it, and I thank Acuta for giving me the opportunity to present it to a broader public. But what I did there was explain the conceptual model as inspired by Robert Schmidt. So if you want to listen to the complete presentation, the complete webinar, then you can find it in this on my YouTube channel, because it's still there and it's for free. You do not have to pay for it. You can just take it in and get to grips with the idea of the Hermetic lots, and it became a series. I published a series on all the issues having to do with the 7 Hermetic lots. So it's a model underlying astrology as a study of fate, and the Greek word for fate is psyche, and that plays an important role in the idea of, for instance, the lot of fortune. And when we talk about the lot of fortune, the lot of the diamond is, of course, its counterpart. And so I will be explaining things about this model again as a recapitulation, because I do not want to repeat a complete webinar that I did for Acuta there in 2020. So check that out if you want a broader interpretation and whatever I said then. And I will now recapitulate some of the more important issues having to do with essentially what you need to understand about the principles of the lots, what they represent and what they signify. So basically what I was addressing and what I've been addressing ever since I studied Hellenistic Greek astrology and the work of Robert Schmidt was this. Actually, you could say that there are 3 levels of delineation. So when we take the first one, these are the archetypes. That is the universal model of astrology, so to speak. In one of my promo videos, I introduced the iceberg, where you could say that the biggest part of everything that astrology entails is under the horizon, under the water level, because the biggest part of an iceberg is underwater, right? And this is the universal model of astrology. This is what we astrologers study. We want to try to understand what all the principles are defining our cosmos in a general sense. So it's a cosmology, so to speak. And that's the archetype. We, as astrologers, try to understand what these principles are and what the planets are doing, etc. So these are the archetypes, level number 1 of the path downward, right? So when you step 1 level down, you come to your own personal natal chart. And what you see then is that everything that is a potentiality on the archetypal level then comes down into your natal chart, which is then an individual promise, because everything that is found in your natal chart is sort of a predisposition. It is, so to speak, perhaps your own toolbox to address the issues of your life, which are all symbolized by, for instance, the images in which the planets find themselves, because that has a relation with the planets having a relation with that specific image. For instance, you see on the 2nd level in my chart, I have the Helios, the sun, and the image of the ram, which means that I need to address Helios by means of the planet Ares, Mars, which is the domicile master of this image of the ram, but the sun itself also has a specific thing to say, and in relation to the image of the ram, because it's exalted in the ram. So these are the principles that are my predisposition in relation to Helios, the sun, and you can see that it is found in the 10th place. So that also has a relation with whatever I do in my life and what I try to achieve, etc., etc. So that's the individual promise. That is my predisposition. That's how I function on a personal level in my own life. It renders my life intelligible by means of trying to get to grips with what it all signifies and what's promised for me. That's also, of course, a fate concept, because that is how the principle of Hymarmene is distributed, and I am apportioned certain things simply by means of the natal chart. That is this picture. So that's my predisposition, how fate will manifest itself in my life, and how I can try to get to grips with it. So that's an interesting one. But going 1 step down further, the 3rd delineation level is the fortune level, and then you can say it's actually sort of landing in the world, right? So the best way to address this is that when you look at the second tier, my own personal natal chart, of course that is influenced by the principles that are above it, which is the archetype, the universal model. But I'm also thrown into this world when I was born, so you can also say that there is something going on with the world itself. It's sort of a, well, it's actually the place where I live, it's the place where you live. So the interesting thing about this, that this fortune level is my chart in the world, so to speak. So, and that is calculated from the lot of fortune. So the lot of fortune is becoming the new worldly ascendant, so to speak. And then the planets are placed in a totally different place. But that is also the place where the lots come into play, because that's the level where the planets trickle down into the world, so to speak, by means of their powers, and there they influence me as a member of humanity and being living in this world and being alive in this world. And that is what this level represents on the level of the of how the lots function in a chart. So I found this model always very, not only stimulating, but also very helpful in trying to get to grips with what everything is signifying when I look at a chart. And I need to keep these things, trying to get them into order and try to get them into sort of a balance. But the idea that the fortune level had to do with something in the world was really revealing for me and really helped me understand how I need to address the issues of whatever lot is signifying. So let me have a closer look at that with you. I would now like to talk about the issue of calculation, because that also has an interesting feature having to do with what I've explained in the previous slides, and it also has to do with why the lots of the especially the Hermetic lot, but in this case specific one, the lot of the daimon, but also the lot of Tyche, the lot of fortune, how it is calculated and what that reveals about what we can do with them, of what the concept behind it is. So let me tell you something about the origin of the principles having to do with the lot of spirit, the lot of the daimon. And when you start top down, you have to start with, of course, Helios, the sun, because the lot of daimon is, of course, the lot having to do with the principles of Helios, the sun. So in principle, Helios, the sun, is this issue. It's representative of dawn, spring. And what happens is that nature awakens and comes to life. And you could say that dealing with the lot of daimon, the lot of the sun, and sort of, you can say that this is a philosophical component of what we're trying to get to with this lot of daimon. So the second one is Helios, the sun, in your chart. So you could say that when on the philosophical level, the sun is that what awakens nature, you could say that the sun in your own chart is the things that awaken you from the inside, or you could say the things that bring you to life, what inspires you to act or to do something, and you could say that that is the inner component. So there is a principle out there which is Helios, the sun, and what happens when the dawn breaks, everything awakens and comes to life, and we step out of bed and we go to work, right? We start our daily jobs and our daily issues. In the natal chart, the sun as a symbol, the symbol of Helios, the sun, is that what awakens you from the inside. Something in you awakens you to act on something. So that inspires you to do something, or inspires you to get into action. And now we get to the lot of the diamond spirit. You could say, as I said in the previous slide, that the lots have to do with things coming down to earth, placed in the environment of the native, and that has to do with something that is around you from the outer world. So
you could say that what awakens you in the outside world, what brings you to life, what inspires you, what stimulates you to action, coming from the outside. So we have a philosophical component, the sun. We have a inner component, which is the glyph of the sun in your natal chart, where the sun lands in your chart, so to speak. And then you have also the trickling down effect of the sun via its lot of daimon, the lot of the sun related to your everyday environment, because it's calculated from the ascendant, and of course the ascendant represents you as the native. And then you could say that that is the outer external component. So this goes, the red numbers 1, 2, 3, that's the, let's say, the inner component. But the black circle is the conceptual circle, 1, 2, 3. But when you start with the lot of the daimon itself, then you could say that it's the reverse order, because we get motivated by things in the outer world. Also, they go together, of course. And when that is the case, when you are inspired by something, and you always hear this in everybody's biography of people having very important experiences, that they encountered something, they saw something, they heard something, and that awoke them to some inner quest for realization of something that they wanted to take action on, wanted to do with their life. So that is the principle of the lot of the daimon. So that happens, of course. We get inspired by things that awakens us from the inside, and then you come to the final phase, which is actually Helios, the sun, as a principle, something coming to life, something inspires you to move on, and that is sort of an idea of making sense of your life. It could also be very spiritual, of course. So this is the perhaps the hermeneutic circle of the principles having to do with the lot of a daimon. So that's at the core of what I will be presenting in this Patreon tract. The first issue that I will address is some confusion can result from the fact that in the mathematical procedures for calculating the lot of the daimon and the lot of fortune, the reversal of the formula for the daimon and the lot of fortune can be very confusing, because the symbolism seems to be compromised by reversing the formula. So I have addressed this before in another talk, and I'll let you see which one it is, so you can look it up on the YouTube channel. But I will give a short recount of what the issue is with this reversal of the lot formula. So let's have a look at it. What's the problem with this? Well, if you look at the formula, you get a certain symbolism and a certain template for interpreting these lots, as I have shown in my previous video. So please refer to that if you're not quite following what I'm saying here. So fortune is the ascendant plus the moon minus the sun, and daimon spirit is the ascendant plus the sun minus the moon. And Apollo of Alexandria called these two lots fortune. He called the ascendant of Selene the moon, and he called daimon spirit the ascendant of Helios the sun. Now when you reverse this formula, it's quite difficult to understand what is happening here, and I have had a lot of discussion with modern astrologers trying to explain what happens when you reverse the formula, and they were always quite confused by the mathematical procedure of doing that. So let's have a look at what the problem really is here, because every tradition has it that for many parts you have to reverse the lot formulas for day and night charts. But the problem is that if you do that, a large number of parts actually lose their symbolic meaning. As I've said, Paul of Alexandria called the fortune, the lot of fortune, he called the ascendant of the moon. So, and if you follow the reasoning behind how these lots are calculated, you can see why that is. Because the moon in this formula locates the lot, so it's sort of the ascendant of the moon. Now, if you reverse the formula, then this logic is violated, because the reasoning behind it becomes quite different. You cannot call the reversed formula of fortune by night the ascendant of the moon, simply because it is the sun in this formula that locates the lot. And you cannot say that this is the ascendant of the moon, because now you're calculating the ascendant of the sun. So what happens is that this quite obviously violates the symbolism, and that's why it's quite difficult to try to explain this to modern astrologers who are only used to calculating lots by means of the reversal of the formula by night. So that's an interesting point. So let me show you how we can look at this procedure and try to explain how this happens and what can be said about it. So I'm going to do it in a different and new way. Welcome, patrons, to this next video on delineating the lot of the diamond spirit, because after the preliminaries, we are now coming to the sort of the heartland of delineating the diamond, the lot of the diamond, the lot of spirit, and what it actually signifies in your chart. And you will notice that there's quite a deep level of understanding when you have the principles at hand to delineate all these things having to do with a lot of the diamond. First of all, I need to go into the principles themselves. And there are two of them, and the first one is, of course, delineating the diamond itself. So I'm not talking about Dispositors yet, but this is about the location of the diamond. So let's have a look. Now, the first thing that we can delineate or have an observation in is the place location of the diamond. So in what place of the chart, one of the 12 places of the chart, is the diamond located? And I did a video on that on my YouTube channel, but I will insert it here simply because I want you to have everything in one video so you can listen to it and you don't have to switch between channels or between videos. So you are getting the talk that I did on that issue and the thing I discovered in my own life with regards to the place location of my lot of the diamond. And it was an interesting one, and it will be very important for us to realize that the location of the diamond has a lot to do with things that interest us from an early age on. It is as if the surroundings, the things around us, attract us in a certain way, and that's a very interesting thing. So the next few slides will be about the video that I did on my YouTube channel. It's the same, so it's not new information perhaps for some of you who have listened to that series on the lot of the diamond that I did there. You cannot reach it anymore because I wanted to keep it for this patron subscription specifically. So have a listen, and I'll be back with you on the other side of this presentation, but you will not notice a difference. So I'll see you. So the conclusion of that discovery and the things that I've noticed with the lot of a diamond in the places is that the place of the diamond is sort of a mirror for your lot of the diamond. And a mirror is, of course, a very Platonic concept, because he talks about the mirroring of the ideas into the concrete world around us. So that's an interesting Platonic principle. But even from an early age, the place location might reflect themes having to do with your daimon, and thus have a formative influence on your soul, the things that you act upon early in life or that pique your interest or whatever. So that's interesting. So let's have a look at the 12 places when they function as mirrors. Was the first important principle having to do with the location of the lot of the daimon itself. And the second one is the cases where there is a planet with the lot of a daimon. And let's have a look at that, what that might signify. This is the next video on delineating the lot of daimon spirit, and I will be addressing the dispositors of the daimon, and especially the most important one, which is the domicile master of the lot of the daimon, which I will call the contractor. So let's have a look. Here you see the factors that I will use to delineate the lot of the daimon, and of course this is what Schmidt taught, so nothing new there. As I said, the domicile master of the lot of the daimon I will call the contractor, and I will explain why that specific term is used for that one. You can also talk about the resources. So when a contractor has to do with how you take action, how you undertake actions, then that is a specific way of motivating the native or you. And the resources you have to do that have to do with the ruler of the ruler, which is the domicile master of the domicile master of the lot of the daimon. So that's an interesting take on what you can describe as the tools that the domicile master has at its disposal to use. Then we will be talking also about the bound ruler, the standard, which has to do something with what motivates the actions of what norm you want to have your actions confirmed to. So that's what the bound ruler has to say about this. And then we have the stimuli, which have to do with the configurations with the domicile master of the lot of the daimon. So you can perhaps see it as in this way. So the question is, how do you act, or what is your strategy, which has to do with this contractor, the domicile master of the daimon. How do you work that, which has to do with the domicile master of the domicile master. That is your resources, your tools, so to speak. What do you focus doing that, or whatever you undertake, which has to do with the bound ruler, setting the bounds, the ruler of the confines. And the other question is what triggers or stimulates or obstructs your actions, and which has to do with the configuration and aspect with the domicile master of your daimon. So in a nutshell, this is what you can approach with all these rulers, with all these principles having to do with the lot of the daimon. So that's an interesting study, and as you will see, it goes really, really deep, and you can get a lot of questions answered when you use this delineation of these dispositors. So let's now have a closer look at the domicile master, the contractor specifically, and not the context in which it is found. So the domicile master, having to do with the native's underlying approach to work, is about the work attitude, your approach to work, the goals you set for yourself, and the style of your actions. So what does this contractor, what type of questions does it answer? So the work attitude is the question, are you a quick responder? Is it very visible in the world? Which of course has to do with the location in a cantron or not, because when it is not in a cantron, you might not be seen as somebody quick responding to things, but other things going on then. So what is your approach to work, to action? So how do you go about it? That's something that the contractor illustrates by its own nature. What do you want to achieve? Now, each planet has a certain thing that it needs to achieve to feel at ease with itself, so that has to do with that planet as well. And what is your style? What characterizes your way of doing things? And I know that we all learn modern astrology, I'm guessing. I was taught that what characterizes your way of doing things has to do with the ascendant, with the first place, the first cantron, and the domicile master of the first cantron. And that has to do, I was taught that has to do and characterizes your way of doing things. But that's not quite the case, because that has to do with how you react to things, how impulses from the outside are worked by you, or received by you, or you get into relation to it, etc., etc. That's not necessarily the way of how you do things. It's how you react to things, perhaps. And that is something different from how the domicile master signifies something in the chart having to do with a lot of a diamond. So it's very specifically something about how you react to things. So the domicile master of the lot of the diamond is the one that reveals how you normally handle your actions and tackle things in a specific and individual way. So it shows your specific style of doing things, how you work, what naturally motivates you, how you tend to cope with obstacles, which is again said not necessarily the way that the ruler of your first image, the ruler of the domicile master of your ascendant does things. That has to do with something having to do with a lot of a diamond, the domicile master of your lot of diamond, and whether your responses or occasions for actions are profitable or proportionate or disproportionate, which might mean that they are overreacting or underreactive. Overreacting is what I described of my Mars in the previous slides. When Mars became the domicile master, I really went at it, and it was quite a disproportionate reaction to my frustrations, etc., which is something having to do with the planet Mars, of course. And what are the possible prevailing internal conflicts you might be experiencing when confronted with various occasions for action? Because each planet has its own way with dealing with frustrations and etc., etc. Okay, so the lot of the diamond of Vincent is located in the 9th place, which is an image sliding off, which generally indicates that he might have had a hard time focusing on the task of undertaking actions in a profitable way. And that has, of course, something to do with the planet Mars itself. So we will be looking into that further on. So generally there may have been difficulties, distractions, false starts and the like when trying to get things done, which was certainly the case in Vincent's life. As he broke off several studies, he never graduated, as you can see with Mars in the 9th, which is the place of education or higher education. His family worried a lot about his constant wanderings and walkabouts, and the walkabouts took place abroad, I believe in the UK especially, but also in France. And these walkabouts have to do with the 9th place, of course, in the foreign countries. And they worried a lot about his inability to get decent jobs and keep them, and they worried about his income. And that you can see by Mars sliding off the 10th place. The family was worried about his social position, and he did not conform to that and did not fit into that. So that's typical of such a lot of the domicile master of the lot of the diamond placed in a place sliding off. But there is something very important, and this sort of relates to my own example when I was in the Pisces period myself. I also have the MC there, so then it does relate to topics having to do with profession, and that was also the case in Vincent's life, as he tried to devote himself to several issues having to do with trying to earn an income and all sorts of things. So we will get into that later. Vincent was his way of doing things, his style or his interaction with people was often qualified as brusque and forward. So he was a bit of a rough type, so to speak. So he was known to be temperamental and extremely stubborn and hardly ever settled down anywhere. And that was true throughout his life. It was reflected, for example, in a great restlessness that led him to rarely stay in one place for long. He wandered a lot and at times even seemed a homeless person with no fixed abode or residence or moving from one place to another. So that is typical of Mars, and of course typical of Mars in the 9th place, the place of wanderings, of being in a foreign place. There's an interesting qualification, interesting citation of this by one Victor Hageman, and he remembered Vincent van Gogh as he had a brief period of study at the Antwerp Academy of Art, and he typified that in the following manner, handed over to us by Louis Pierrard. So, very interesting. It's almost funny to read it. About Van Gogh's arrival in the Academy of Antwerp, I have recorded the following recollections from the mouth of Victor Hageman. I was a student in the drawing class at the time, and he only stayed there for a few weeks, typical of Mars. I remember very well that unpolished, nervous, anxious man who had dropped in the Academy of Antwerp like a bomb, typical Mars word, bomb, causing upheaval among director, teacher and pupils. What the pupils had to paint that day were two wrestlers posing naked to the waist on a pedestal. Van Gogh began to paint feverishly and frantically, with a speed that astonished his fellow pupils. He had applied the paint so thickly, Hageman told us, that the paint literally dripped off the canvas onto the floor. Vincent stayed in the academy for several weeks, diligently drawing. He suffered visibly in his efforts to grasp the form. He worked quickly without making corrections and usually tore up his drawings or threw them behind it as soon as he had finished one. Now please note all the martial keywords in this quote: unpolished, nervous, like a bomb, stirring, painting feverishly and frantically, speed, diligent, worked quickly without making corrections, and usually tore up his drawings or threw them behind him. Clearly describing the way Vincent went about things and doing things, his manner of actions, in this case trying to learn to paint. I find this quite a funny quote, but it's also very typical of someone having a Mars as the contractor of the lot of the diamond. It's really a very interesting and revealing quotation. As I said before in this presentation, in this video, I'm still impressed when reading all these quotes and how well they fit the character of Mars as a dispositor of Vincent's diamond. I'm actually quite in awe of this method, because it gets you so deep into the heart of some of the motivations of what people do and why they act. And well, I believe it's clearly illustrated by all these quotes of Vincent himself or people around him, of how they were impressed by him and the way he worked and what he showed to them. So far I've dealt with these matters. So the fact that Mars, of course, first of all, is the ruler of his lot of diamond, but also that the Mars is in a place flowing forth, slipping aside, that is addressed, and that is illustrated with quotations. The fact that his 9th place is slipping aside from the 10th, which is the place at the peak, so it has to do a lot with sliding off the normal manners in which society conceives of what is a successful life by means of what you do in life and your walk of life. And of course Vincent diverted from that massively. And the fact that Mars does not belong to the second favor, being a nocturnal planet in a diurnal chart, which has its own specific problems, typical issues correlated with someone's actions. But that's not quite everything, because now we still need to address the next issues which we can delineate using the domicile master of the lot of the diamond. So there's much more, because the general qualities and characteristics of Aries Mars are influenced and modified by the conditions of Mars in Vincent's horoscope. So let me enumerate them, and that it will be the topic of the next video on Vincent and his Mars, his Aries way of approaching actions. So the following horoscope factors relate to them. The fact that Mars is on the disposition of Zeus, because when I address the issue that whenever a lot is concerned, the domicile master of the lot is not supplying anything to the planet, but does, because that is the relation of Mars to the daimon. Mars represents the manager of the actions that are incited by the lot of the daimon, but the domicile master of Mars itself has to do with what is offered to Mars as things to work with. So that's an important thing to take into account. I will address that in the next video. The second thing is that Mars is in its own confines, in its own terms, in its own, not its own domicile, but in its own domain within the domicile of the fishes. An interesting take also. And then the fact that Mars is advocated by Venus, because Venus is a planet situated together in the same image as Aries, which is a very different thing from being in aspect to a planet. So that is called an advocation advocate. The planets support each other, they stimulate each other, and they act as advocates for each other. And the fact that Mars is configured with other planets, which has a lot to do with the stimuli that have to do with the things that motivate his actions, primarily. And then I need to address the issue that Mars is in a fortune angle, because as you cannot see it here, but the lot of fortune is also in the fishes. So that is a very interesting thing. So Mars itself is in a fortune angle, and that might have a lot of impact on whatever this is signifying. So I will address that further on. I'm not quite sure if the fortune houses are a topic that will be addressed in the next video, but it's certainly something I need to take into account, because it's a very important thing having to do with, again, the level of where fortune acts, namely in the fortune places, and that's exactly the place where also the lots themselves are located and at work, the things befalling us. So that needs to be addressed. In the line of the topics that we need to address, now we're at the second one. We're going to address the resources that are at the hands of Vincent Mars, which is called the ruler of the ruler, but that's a bit of a misnomer, so let's address that. So when we talk about the resources that are at the hands of a certain planet in a certain image, then we address the principle of the ruler, but that's a bit of a misnomer, because we are talking about the domicile master of the domicile master, which has to do with the tools that are at the disposal of a certain planet being located in a specific image. So we can refer to those sort of the style or the work habits that someone has, the things that are informing the planet that is the master of your lot of the daimon, and inspires it to act. So that's pretty important. So here we have the definition. The task of the domicile master is to be a good host. He needs to pay attention to and to heed the impulse of the daimon. So in Vincent's chart we investigated the domicile master of his daimon, which is Aries Mars, in the previous video. And now we're going to investigate his Mars being located in the fishes. So we have to look at its domicile master, which is Jupiter, of course. So the question is, what does the domicile master of Mars provide his guest with? What tools does Jupiter provide Vincent with as the resources or the inspiration for his actions? So again, the question then is, what kind of tool is Jupiter? When a planet is put at your disposal as being a sort of a tool to work with, then the question is what kind of tool that planet actually is. So what qualities and competences are at Vincent's disposal to achieve his Martian goals, because that has a lot to do with what Mars wants to achieve, right? So they are sort of also an inspiration for to act on. That's the right definition, I think. So what methods and techniques, what Jupiterian resources and characteristics are available and at Vincent's disposal in carrying out his actions. And we must never forget that the way Vincent acts or responds to any input is always in the manner of Mars, because that is the domicile master of his lot of the daimon. So it's always Mars acting or reacting to the impulse of Jupiter, and it's not Jupiter being at work. So that's very important. That's a big difference in this principle. So you need to take that into account. So let's have a look. So after this delineation of the domicile master of the domicile master, the ruler of the ruler, we go to the next one, which is the delineation of the bound ruler. And before I do that, I of course need to explain what the bound ruler actually signifies. Now we can say that the bound ruler often functions as a channel into which one pours or aims the activity of a planet into, or it allows the energy of a planet to be shaped by it. So we can have a look at the way that Vincent worked, for instance, as an artist. So Mars located in its own bound or confine grants Mars autonomy, because Mars need not to restrict himself to the canon of another planet, but he can simply address himself to his own canon. So that you can say that he is autonomous in sort of in a sense. He sort of shapes himself. He conforms himself, as it were, to his own Martian principles. Mars focuses on himself, on his own principles. So in general, this means that Mars can be self-motivated, or that Vincent is self-motivated in his actions, which was certainly the case. And Mars does things for the sake of Mars things themselves. This also contributes to his stubbornness, his obstinacy, and his persistence. So let's have a look at how this functioned in the way he worked as an artist. So I can quote from the Wikipedia sites on Vincent's work. He was a unique artist who worked with a sense of urgency, Mars, which often caused him a great deal of stress, Mars. He was famed for his bold, dramatic brushstrokes, Mars, which expressed emotion and added feelings of movement to his work, movement, Mars. It's thought that he often used paint straight from the tube, which is called impasto technique, and in the 70s days leading up to his death, he averaged one painting per day. Wow. Mars. In addition to impasto, Van Gogh also made heavy use of brushstrokes. His brushstrokes were often thick and textured. According to legend, he applied the paint directly to the canvas and mixed it up with his own hands. So this certainly characterizes his painting style, how he worked. And he always tried to grasp the essence and avoid all externality, so all the fancy thing and ornamentation. So you can see this as Mars being the counterpart of Venus. This is how he worked, and we will later address Venus being with Mars, but Mars is the way he worked. So that has a sort of a dominance in the principle of how he worked in his art. So here you can see the effect of impasto. In this, you can see the thick paint put on the canvas, so that's a clear example of it. And it's a bit of a rough, but also pretty neat and pretty way of working. It looks pretty good. And this is the heavy use of brush strokes, which was a very interesting manner in which that he developed of trying to paint something in a realistic sense as possible, and that is a very pretty way of doing that, and also a very effective way. So he was in that sense an innovative artist, Mars. He worked with easy methods because some people say that these brushstrokes are actually in a sense trying to camouflage the idea that he was not that good a painter in what he did, because he had to learn it when he was pretty old in his age, from his 27th year onwards, I believe. So he was late in his development, but this was a very elegant and pretty effective way of getting past these, perhaps the difficulties of not having had an education in painting. So he was quite effective in that sense. So in our range of principles that we are using to delineate the specific things going on about the domicile master of the lot of the daimon, we are now addressing the ideas of the stimuli, the configurations to the domicile master of the lot of the daimon. They have a lot to do with what triggers the actions of the native. Now in this specific video I will be addressing this person. There he is again, ist wieder da, there he is again. This is of course the chart of Adolf Hitler, and the reason why I'm doing his chart is because Robert Schmidt did a fantastic delineation of everything going on with the domicile master of the lot of daimon of Hitler, and that's also a good synopsis of what we've addressed so far, but it's also a very clear take on how the aspects and configurations with the domicile master played such an important role in his life, and it explains a lot about what happened when he was in power. But I also want to include a disclaimer, because this delineation of Hitler's daimon, its dispositor and its configurations is, and please note, it's in no way, shape or form an attempt to rehabilitate him, nor is it an expression on my part of any sympathy for his ideas of what he caused and what he did. Please take note of that, because I'm of course not a fan of Mr. Hitler because all dreadful things that he did. But you should also know that anyone who, like Hitler, has Cronus Saturn as the lord of the daimon, which includes me myself also, and possibly with similar configuration and aspects, please do not fear, because this description follows his biographical data, not yours. And it's not that these facts and natal conditions lead to the same terrible consequences as was the case with Hitler, so please take note of that. So let's have a look at Mr. Hitler and what's his lot of daimon suggests to us. So now we can move on to the scenario. How is the scenario constructed and what do you see with it? And this is a quotation from Robert Schmidt in his tutorial on this method. I advise everybody to study that one. He said the incident in the client's life should naturally fall together into events according to the Zodiacal Releasing scenario. And that has to do with what I said in the previous slide. This method really teaches you how to interpret the natal chart, and you can see how the natal chart actually is functioning in time, sort of. So that's a very interesting study in my opinion. So here we have the 5 turning points that are very important and can give a lot of information about what's going on in a native's life. And well, these are the 5 turning points. The first 4 are the ones that Schmidt mentioned, and the 5th are the ones that I didn't discover them, but I noticed them because they were specific for a nativity having to do with certain chart conditions. So the first one is finding the or a life work. The second is the losing of the bond. The third is periods of defining events. And the 4th is turning points itself. And the 5th one is the specific periods for this native alone. So I will be dealing with the first one in this video. So let's have a look at finding the, a, or a life work. Now let me first define for you what these specific focus periods and turning points are about and how you can see them in your scenario. So the first one, which I will be dealing with in this video, is finding the life work. And you find that when you encounter the Lord of the Lot of the Daimon in any L2 minor period under a major period. And this is disrespective of which image distributes the L1 period under investigation, but I will show you an example of that. The second one, the period of losing the bond, is whenever the major Time Lord hands over to the domicile Lord of the opposite image. This changes the dynamic of the rest of the major period, and this can only happen under L1 periods in the images of the twins, the crab, the lion, the virgin, the goat-horned one, and the water pourer, and that has to do with the length that these images distribute. So we'll have a look at that. The third one is the period of defining events for the entire period, and this is when you encounter the Lord of the major L1 period in a L2 minor period under this L1 period. It sounds a bit complicated, but it's pretty easy. Whenever for example, you encounter Mercury located in the scales, which is an L2 of phases under the L1 major period of the twins. So that's a period of a defining event, and the reason is that, of course, the ruler of the Lord of the major period is again emphasized because it's now in the L2 image where we have arrived in this scenario. Okay, then the fourth one is a turning point whenever we come to the other image of the major Time Lord. So, for instance, you in the L2 period under the under the major period of Gemini, you arrive in the image of the Virgin, which is the other image of Mercury. So, well, these are the focus periods and turning points. So yeah, you can work with them and try to find them in your scenario or the scenario of any client or persons you know, and then you can try to find out what's going on in that period. So, but now I will be focusing especially on the Lord of the Lot of the Daimon when this is encountered, and then we call that the finding of a life work.
Hey everybody, back with a new video on the fascinating material provided to us by Zodiacal Releasing. And in this case, again, we are moving through the scenario, and I want to address the issue of what you could call the boost effect. Something sometimes helps to give sort of a push forward in life, in a career, in something happening in your life, etc. So let's have a look. Now, the first thing to investigating boosts in your life can have to do with the triplicity rulers of the second. Whenever the triplicity rulers are activated in the scenario, then you might expect sort of a principle having to do with eminence, because that's when I first talked about it in a video series on my YouTube channel. So you might want to have a look at that, but let me simply briefly explain what this is all about. So this is the table of the triplicity rulers, and you can see that there is a difference between night and day charts. In the sense that the first and the second triplicity ruler changes place. So at night, when you have your second in one of the fire-like images, like of the ram, the lion, or the bowman, then when you're born during the day, then Helios is the first triplicity ruler, but when you're born by night, when the moon is in one of these images, then the first triplicity ruler would be Jupiter. So that's the difference between these. So having a look at my chart, of course my chart is a day birth, so I need to look indeed at the three triplicity rulers belonging to the fiery triplicity, the fire-like images. So the first one is Helios, the Sun, the second is Jupiter, and the third cooperating triplicity ruler is Saturn. Kronos Saturn. So let's have a look what that might suggest. So here you see my first period under the rulership of the water power, and then of course also Saturn. So you can see in the table here with the numbering after each planet that is one of the triplicity rulers, you can see T1, T2 or T3 indicating the triplicity rulers. So this is when they are activated in this first period of my life. So, and again, I apologize for using my own chart, but on the other hand, I do have quite a extensive, let's say, a data sheet of everything that was going on in my life, especially the latter periods, because then I started really investigating that, and the first periods are a bit empty, so to speak, because I do not quite remember that much about all these periods, but the latter periods are very interesting, of course. So, and I wrote many things in my diary, so to speak, my a diary which I kept on this computer. So yeah, let's have a look. I do not remember anything about the first one when it was 1962. The only thing that happened was that I moved house in the village where I was born, but that's the only thing I can remember, and I cannot associate that in any manner with being the triplicity ruler. Helios the Sun being the triplicity ruler in this 15-month period, so I'm not sure what happened there. So again, looking at 1974, that's when I started playing guitar, and of course some of you might remember that Saturn, of course, is also the planet that is the domicile master of my lot of Daimon, so that also suggested something having to do with finding a life work. And when I started playing guitar, that was of course a very important thing that I really associated with. This is going to be my career. So that's interesting. But again, Saturn is also the third triplicity ruler, and the general rule of thumb is that it needs to cooperate with the other two by means of being in aspect with it. So you can see that Saturn is in aversion with Jupiter. It's because it's in the adjacent sign, but it's in a tetragonal relationship with Helios the Sun. So yeah, there is some support for Helios the Sun, and there is no support for Jupiter as being a triplicity ruler. So the third one is not cooperating with Jupiter, but on the other hand, Saturn is of course pretty favorably placed in my chart because it's in a pivot, and it's also in its own domicile of the goat horn one. So yeah, that's pretty good, I think. And it's also supportive of the planet, my sect-light, which is Helios the Sun, of course. Interesting combination, of course. Well, the interesting thing is also, and I want to emphasize this, that when I had the losing of the bond in 1976, then of course Helios the Sun is the joint master ruling the periods after the losing of the bond, because then Helios the Sun is the one calling the shots, so to speak. So that's interesting to take note of in any losing of the bond in anybody's life, of course. And when that planet is also one of the triplicity rulers, then it's of course can be certainly a push or a boost from that period on. So yeah, that certainly happened in my life. And I need to mention, of course, number 3, triplicity ruler number 3, which started in 1982. And I've talked about 1983, of course, as my coming out, in the sense that I had a whiff of something wanting to do with my life. And you can see also Saturn there, finding a life work. Yes, and that was the period that I discovered astrology, and that was such a big impact on me. And I think that has to do with the fact that now in this period Saturn is in combination, of course, a tetragonal and a superior position with Helios the Sun, which is now the the planet taking over these L2 periods under the goat horn one. Under the water pore. So yeah, that was really interesting, adding to the importance of this major period. So that was a very big influence on my life. So yeah, interesting. And this is also an interesting one because as I find my calling, so to speak, in this period, 1988 was really the period that I started teaching at an astrological academy, which I started with a colleague of mine, and I did that for 10 years. So that was really also something having to do with prominence, in the sense that, well, it was really a very pleasant push towards the goals that I was setting for myself as being an astrologer, and of course having to do with the things that I wanted to do with my life and with my career. So that was a very illustrative of the principle having to do with these triplicity rulers. So let's have a look at the next period of my life. Hello my dear patrons. Onwards with the next video on moving through the scenario with Zodiacal Releasing. But first of all, of course, I want to wish you all the best for the new year, 2024, and let's hope it's a good one. So on to the next video. Now the terminology having to do with the pivots needs to be somewhat tweaked, I think, because a lot of people think, well, these planets are the strongest in the chart. Well, Schmidt said it's not so much about power, but it has to do with a level of activity. So planets in these pivotal places in the what we now call the angles of a chart, but where do you find an angle in a round circular image? These planets are very central and things move around them. They are sort of a center of attention and things are rotating around them, so to speak. So that has to do with the principle of being busy and being central to the what's going on there. So, and the Greek words for that are krematistikos, and when planets are falling amiss, they are akrematistikos. So planets in the 12th, in the 2nd, the 6th and the 8th place are not that busy because they are in the not located in a relation with the ascending image, and that's why they are called akrematistikos. They are not that busy, and they are, so to speak, well, again, that suggests that they are weak, but that's not quite true. They are weaker in comparison as to the activity that they are showing. So please take that into account. The idea is that it has to do with conducting business, and there are places where a lot of action is going on, and there are places where little action is going on. So that's the difference between these principles. But there's also another thing to take into account when we are talking about boosts, where things are really strongly activated, because I showed a slide where it's pretty clear that when the planets are pivotal, that's not necessarily about strength, it's more about being very busy or being very active. And then we can use also the fortune places, the houses counted from the location of the lot of fortune. So yeah, leaving traces with fortune places, that's really an extra boost perhaps. So let's look at some examples. And the principle is quite simple. We'll be looking at a chart that has the fortune pivots coinciding with the natal pivots. So you sort of have this double whammy idea, because of course all angular and pivotal places in a chart have a pretty interesting effect on the activity of planets there being active, being very active. And when fortune pivots coincide with these natal pivots, then you could say that there's sort of an extra boost, because the fortune pivots have a lot to do with, let's say, the circumstances and principles having to do with fate befalling you. So there might be a very extra double whammy boost going on. Let's have a look. Now, before we delve into the natal chart of Julian Assange and the trials and tribulations of his life, there are some preliminary considerations to take into account, so let's have a look at them. And there's another preliminary consideration we need to take into account, and that has to do with the fortune places, because the question always is, what are they? How do they function in a chart, and what can we do with them? And last year, in the beginning of this year, I started a new tier which I did not continue, but in one of the videos on that topic, I addressed this issue of the fortune places, and I want to repeat that here. So some of you, I believe 2 of you, are already familiar with this material, but the other students are not. So I do want to introduce it here because it's a very interesting speculation of how we might use the fortune places in evaluating a natal chart. So that's the reason why I'm putting it in here, and I'm sorry for the people who already know this, but it's never harming to repeat some stuff. So let's have a look at that. So I would now like to do a short biographical sketch. The word sketch suggests, of course, that it's short. It's an overview along broad lines. I'm not going into much details of his natal chart, but the sketch is perhaps enough to see whether or not the chart that we are using, that I am using, coincides with things going on in his life. So let's have a look. So here we have the scenario, the chapters of his life. When we are agreed that this is the natal chart and that the lot of daimon is in the lion, which is the 9th place where also the portional MC is found. So charting out the 4 periods, there might be more, but these are the ones that he went through or is actually at the moment in. So yeah, this is the Zodiacal Releasing scenario and the chapters within it. Another thing to take note of is that when you look at the aspect grid in whole sign places, then you can see there are many aversions, which means that these planets cannot testify to each other, and that might also have an impact on how the scenario works out. Whenever one of these planets that is in aversion to another one becomes a Time Lord, then it's perhaps difficult for the other planet to have a say in it. So yeah, something to take note of course, and we've been through a lot of these issues in previous videos. Another thing I want to point out is this. In the software Planet Dance, there is this really fantastic tool to have a look at whenever planets turn retrograde or turn direct. So that's important to take note of, because I do use secondary progressions especially for these phenomena. So when you look at for instance Aries Mars, then you can see that in his 8th year Mars went retrograde because it's forward moving, which means that at his birth chart, which is at the 3rd of July, Aries Mars was pretty slow moving because he was about to turn retrograde, which happened in the 8th day after his birth, which corresponds to the 8th year of age for Julian. When you look at Jupiter went forward 21 days after this natal chart, which means that it corresponds to the 21st year of his life. And you can also see that Mercury turns retrograde 40 days after his birth, which means that in his 40th year, Mercury turns retrograde. And these can also have an important role sometimes in things going on in the native's life in these ages, because these turning points of the planets called phases in Hellenistic astrology might signal important events happening, or a certain turn of events having to do with the significations of that planet. So take these into account because they can be very important, as you will see with Julian Assange as well. So let's have a look. Addressing the ethical idea, and further investigating that, I thought, well, that must have to do with either Venus or Jupiter, because Jupiter, of course, is the principle of justice, and Venus is well, let's say, I think she's ethical in her way of dealing with things and dealing with people. So the interesting thing is, I think, let me check the bound rulers, because these are very important as being the three belonging to the three major things to investigate. That's either the domicile master, the exaltation lord, and the bound lord, the lord of the confines. So, and here we see that both lights, Helios the sun and Selene the moon, are in the bounds of Venus. So that's interesting. And I also see, of course, that Mercury and the ascendant as well are also in the bounds of Jupiter, which also is something having to do with ethics, I think. And this is what Robert Schmidt had to say about them. When I paraphrase him, being in the bounds of certain planets, that means that they, both lights in this case, are indebted to her, to Venus. They follow her canon, her rules. Venus sort of owns them. That's an interesting thing to take note of, and an interesting formulation. So he said, for what or for whom or for what principle are you doing this? Is this planet acting? That this being, of course, the planet that is in the bounds and the confines of a specific planet. And here we are talking about Helios, the sun, and the moon. So to what standard must it conform? That is the principle that Schmidt addressed with relation to the bounds and the confines. So I believe I did this in earlier videos, but let me simply repeat what Schmidt had to say about the idea of the bound lords, what they were all about. They are very interesting. And that's the reason why they are such an important investigation in this type of astrology. So with this, I come to the end of this second presentation on the biography and the trials and tribulations of Julian Assange. And the first two were all about how to get to grips with what's going on in his chart, of course under the proviso that we whether or not this is the correct chart that we have for his life. But I hope that it also showed how you can approach Zodiacal Releasing when you have the life of a person and you know something about it, and how you can proceed in trying to get to grips with what's seen and what's promised in the natal chart, and when this comes to fruition when you use a Time Lord method. So there will be a third video on Julian Assange's plights, because as you know, the trials and tribulations started in this period of the scales under Aphrodite Venus, and we need to investigate how the difficulties that he had in this period are shown by that period and whatever happens afterwards. And of course, everybody knows that there was the court case having to do with whether or not he should be extradited are still going on, because I read that the definite ruling on that by the court in the UK is still at large, in the sense that they will postpone a ruling on that, because and it's postponed, I believe, into May. So he's scot-free at the moment. He's still in jail, I believe, but whether or not he will be extradited is still a hanging matter. So it's not quite sure if that will happen. So I will be using the next video on the trials and tribulations of Julian Assange, trying to deal with what can be seen in the periods, what was going on when all this stuff was going on in his life, having to flee in the Ecuadorian what's called, I forget how it's called, but when he was in hiding there for 7 years, and then he was put into prison in the UK, etc., etc. So I will deal with that in the next video, and I hope you enjoyed this one, and hopefully you've learned something. For me, it's also always when I do this, because I'm never acquainted with somebody's biography instantly. So that's always a sort of an expedition for me as well, to try to see how all these things work out in a specific chart. So yeah, it's for me, it's also always a learning experience. So take that, keep that in mind, and try to use this for a biography that you know of, or of a person that you find very interesting, perhaps a well-known person. Check out their biography and check out how you can see whatever was going on in that person's life with this method of zodiacal releasing. So I will be moving on to the next video, trying to explain whatever was going on in the periods that were most difficult for him, I guess. So until next time.
So if you are new to this material, you can read all about it, about my tier for Patreon, how you can acquaint yourself with this method, and I really like this method a lot because it goes beyond the idea of trying to find hits in somebody's life for when important things happen, and this method really puts things into sort of a perspective based on astrological principles having to do with when a period starts and lasts for many years, which is often the case. The shortest period is 8 years, having to do with the rulership of Venus, and the longest period is of course those of Saturn, which might even be up to 27 years or 30 years, depending on which image of Chronos Saturn is the one is the one that is distributing the times for a certain person. So that's really interesting in the sense that it really makes you aware of how things change when these zodiacal releasing periods change from this image to another image, which has to do with a certain year in your life. And then a lot of things can change simply because the aspects to, for instance, the domicile master of that specific image ruling the new period of time has some other things waiting for you when you are experiencing it. So that's really a very powerful tool in the hands of an astrologer, and here you can learn all about it.